time. Welcome to the first afternoon session of Track 1, and I am pleased to introduce our speaker, Ms. Wendy Nather. Wendy is a research director at the Retail Cyber Intelligence Sharing Center. She was previously research director of the information security practice of the independent analyst firm 451 Research. Okay. She led IT security for the EMEA region of the investment banking division of the Swiss Bank Corporation, now UBS. Okay. Wendy is the co-author of the Cloud Security Rules and was listed as one of SC Magazine's Women in IT Security Power Players in 2014. She is an advisory board member for the RSA conference and serves on the board of directors for Securing Change, an organization that helps provide free security services for nonprofit organizations. And she's based right here in Texas, in Austin. I think she is going to tell us how Google turned her into her mother. Okay.
All right,
welcome.
Thank you.
Take it away.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thanks, everybody. So, yeah, I'm with what I guess you would generally call the retail ISAC. We didn't make up the RSIS name. I know it autocorrects to Cisco. There's nothing I can do about it. So this isn't really retail, specifically retail-oriented, except that it's a widespread problem that I don't think enough people are talking about. And since I have lived this for the last several years, I thought this is something that I would discuss that we really need to take it to pay attention to, not just in IT in general, but in security specifically. So I want to talk first about, the idea of proxying versus delegation. So generally in IAM, if you're delegating to somebody, they retain their credentials, their identity, but they have entitlements that allow them to, act out the certain, carry out certain functions that nominally would belong to somebody else. But you have that relationship made visible, so you know this is a delegate for this person. For a proxy, in general, a proxy is, I'm going to pretend to be this person, and you talk to me as if you were talking to that person. And so we do this in networking. We do this whenever we log into somebody else's account, and are acting in a non-transparent way as them with all of their entitlements. And, this bleeds into the real world. For example, the concept of the healthcare proxy, when you are deputized legally in a document to speak for somebody else on their behalf if they can't make medical decisions for themselves. This happens, if you have a kid, you're making medical decisions for them. It will happen if you are taking care of a loved one who's incapacitated, your parents, whoever. Another one that you guys may or may not be familiar with is the concept of the durable power of attorney. And that is basically another document in which you are empowered to carry out financial transactions, real estate transactions, or any other legal transactions on behalf of somebody. Now, there are two ways that you can execute a durable power of attorney. It can either be take effect upon incapacitation, which is the way people usually sign it. So if I ever become incapacitated, my spouse will be able to, make these decisions for me. The other way is with immediate effect. Starting right now, anytime my spouse wants to, needs to make a decision, they can do so. They can sign papers for me at any time. That's going to be a very important distinction as we go along, because, well, first of all, you guys all know the difference between root and sudo, but again, in the technical world, there's a difference between having an SU account and it being very transparent as to you retaining your own credentials and you're carrying out things. And there's a specific list of things that you can carry out. It may be a subset of what the other person can do that you're acting on behalf of. And then, of course, root, everything goes. So even in the technical world, not everybody logs what activity is being done in either capacity, but certainly in the real world, nobody logs what you do with a durable power of attorney. If somebody has to examine it later, they have to, do actual paper forensics and figure out what it was you did on that person's behalf. RBAC, I give RBAC a hard time sometimes, but it has its time and place, but it doesn't deal with this terribly well. There are a lot of things that RBAC doesn't deal with well. First of all, the roles are generally a bundle of entitlements. Sometimes you don't want to hand over all the entitlements, so again, you want to give a subset of what that role has, but then you have to peel those off. And sometimes, they're only for a certain period of time. Bob's on vacation today, I'm going to be Bob. And you never know in a given business day what you might be called upon to do as Bob on that one day when he's away on vacation. So it used to be that, old-fashioned RBAC was a group of entitlements, and it was based on your position in the organization. So if you were a senior director, you got this senior director role, which meant these senior director entitlements. They might be on behalf of your particular department, so the role would be even more specific. You are senior director of HR, and therefore your entitlements in the system are mapped in that context. Whenever you need more access, you just get some more roles, and administrators get all the roles because they have to do everything once in a while. That's the way it used to work, and not very well. Not terribly well at all. So first of all, RBAC in the enterprise assumes that you're either a customer or an employee. And it also, you have to figure out why somebody has a particular role, because there are reorgs. Things change, titles change, departments change, and when you find a really old role name, you can't for the life of you figure out why this person ever had it to begin with, why they still have it now, and what it really means, that they should be able to do. There are whole products out there now to help you figure out what these old, crufty role names are, what the entitlements map to, and what the union of them are, or the combinations. With unexpected effects that you may not have planned out when you gave all these roles to somebody. Did you know if you put this one and this one and this one together, you're suddenly able to write, sign, and cash checks all at the same time? That's the sort of thing that these tools are out there now today to help you figure out, and it's the problem we got into because of RBAC. It doesn't reflect different axes of governance, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit more, and it doesn't support context switching. So if you're working for more than one organization or department, when I worked for the Texas Education Agency, we had to have roles that mapped out to different functions in the districts, but some people work for more than one district at a time. We had also, I don't know if you know how many districts we have in Texas, school districts. There were about 1,300 when I was working for TEA. Some of them are enormous, like Houston. Houston is enormous. And just, managing those entitlements, which is supposed to be the superintendent's job, that is a huge, huge thing for the Houston Independent School District. Then you have little tiny ones where we would call up the superintendent, and he was also the girls' high school basketball coach, and when we called him, he was bringing in the crops. So you can have a whole range of different circumstances where the same nominal role will map to a bunch of different capabilities. Some will be needed and some won't. There may be legal requirements for separation of duties, and there certainly are in a lot of cases where even if you are working in two roles, you have to log out when you're working on behalf of this organization, and then you have to log in to work on behalf of this organization and make sure the two the streams never cross. And the union of entitlements is not okay. You can't just pile them all on somebody and say, okay, you can do all of these things, because at some point you might be doing one or the other of them. So I used to talk about this, about how context plus the governance really describes what you should be able to do. There's the identity authority, the access authority. The identity authority can determine who you are in the context of what you're asking for and why you should have that access. So speak for them. Yes, Bob really needs to do this. I know the title doesn't match what's in the books, but this is what Bob does when he's not bringing in the crops. So this is what he needs to do. And then an access authority decides what you may access if they are the steward of the data, for example, or they're legally responsible for access to that data. So the identity authority validates who you are in whatever context. You could be all sorts of things. Yes, in the Internet of Things, that is a cow. I identify that as a cow. I'm the farmer identifies the cow. That's my cow. Shout out to Phoenix, of course, and Javad, because I just have to. But they can say, yes, you're a CISSP, you can do this. Yes, you are a teacher in this school district. Yes, you are a VP in this department at this bank. But then it gets even hairier, because it's not just about who you are. It's about what you can do. So the function is the first thing that you should be looking at in identity and access management. And then that is bounded by the scope of what you are granted. And that leads to the author, and then you have to have the authorization to perform those functions. Those three elements need to be in what you are building for your users. So you can kind of describe it as, a game of clues. So Professor Plum can do something in the kitchen with a lead pipe, or he can do something in the kitchen with a candlestick. Or if he is going to the library, then he has two other possibilities of entitlements, two other functions he can perform, but that's in the library. Then it gets, but you're missing the context, because he could be killing or he could be killed in the library or in the kitchen with those things. And as you can see, they're not the same set of entitlements based on whether you are killing or you're in the kitchen. Actually, no, I lied. It's even more complex than that. So it's, depending on whether you are killing, where you are killing, that is the scope of your function. With which entitlements or with which systems, with which particular applications, all of these come into play. Which is why identity and access management administrators drink a lot, even more than normal security people do, which is a lot. So that when you are being authorized to do this, somebody has to attest that you are associated with that organization. And if you are with an organization and you own the data, you may determine, or you may have to determine, what somebody can do with it, and you have to be the final authority. Which is why federation, just straight federation, doesn't work a lot in enterprises, especially where there are regulations involved, because somebody in the organization with the data has to have the final say, regardless of what the attesting authority says. So the relying authority is, to use the technical term, may rely on somebody else to say, yes, this is a teacher, but the data steward still has to say, regardless of whether they're a teacher or not, I have to do my own checking and do my own authorization, because it's the data that I'm legally bound to protect. So there's that extra step. So where federation can work very well is when you have, 1,300 districts, and you don't want to, and you can't do all of those adds and changes and deletes in one little office on behalf of all of those staff and all of those teachers. So you can push that out to the districts and make the superintendent in charge of that, at least as far as their district is concerned. So they can vouch for their staff, but they still can't be the only one to grant them access to Texas student data. That's the job of the agency. So it's very complex, but it gets even worse when you have non-enterprise roles. You're a citizen, you're a doctor. With HIPAA, the name of a patient is confidential, but a doctor isn't. What if the doctor becomes a patient? All of a sudden, the context switches. You may be a broker, you may be an insurance broker operating on behalf of a bunch of different insurance companies, and you may be all of those at the same time or different. So the functions in the scope are different. Now, one of the things that we're really not addressing is what about consumers? So, for example, we generally should be anticipating the needs for a proxy for minor children, for online things. If you are a parent and you have to sign up, with the online grade system for your kid's school system. These are sort of things we expect to have happen. But there are lots of unanticipated needs. There are incapacitated adults. So incapacitation can be sudden. You can get hit by a car and be in the hospital for a month. It can be temporary, or it can be periodic. And this is something that people with chronic illnesses have to deal with. This is what people with disabilities have to deal with, and it's something that seniors have to deal with. Usually, often a decline, even dementia in seniors, comes and goes. There are days when they're perfectly on top of things, and there are other days when they are not. So there's no one time when you can say, yes, they are incapacitated. And that's the problem. Taking on a role as their proxy takes time. You have to go around, you have to convince them to sign papers, you got to get them notarized, and all this sort of stuff. And going back to the durable power of attorney, I talked about whether it can take effect either immediately or upon incapacitation. And I can tell you from personal experience now that I would urge you, if you're going to sign a document like that, have it take effect immediately. Because otherwise, trying to convince somebody that they're incapacitated and trying to prove it legally, first of all, can destroy your relationship with them, especially if they're a senior parent. They will fight you all the way. Again, because of the periodic nature of what they might be going through, some days they're fine, some days they're not. And also, it takes a very long time. What's a lot easier is if you have it take effect immediately, and you can say, Mom, I know you're not feeling good today. Why don't I just log in and take care of this for you? You want me to pay this bill? Okay, I'll pay this bill. So if you can get that sort of access, that's a lot better for your relationship. It's a lot faster when you need to use it. You don't have to use it all the time. You're not displacing them, you're assisting them. And that's an important way to frame it to them. Can you give me permission to help you when you need it with these sorts of things? When I signed one for my husband, my attorney said, are you sure you want to do this? You want it with immediate effect? And I said, first of all, I could be sick tomorrow. But also, if I trust him then to do this for me, I trust him now. So, that's another important argument to be made for that. So, IT does not keep up with this. One example is that for our online prescription ordering and insurance website thing, when my oldest turned 13, they sent me a notification that said that he had to create his own account, and then he had to authorize me to continue to manage his prescriptions for him. So they sent me an email and said, he needs to create his own account. Oh, we need another account. Okay. I set up another account. I used a different email because I figured they would check for that. I authorized myself, and then I went back to work. So these are the sorts of things that, they don't work on very well. Most of these things where you are doing proxy or delegation authorization online, they don't do a lot of validation. They either check to see that you have a different email address from the other person. They check certain demographic data. And of course, I knew all of this about my 13-year-old, so it was very easy to set it all up. Another thing I ran into was where you could set up delegation authority online, but to revoke it, you had to do it on paper. It's like, what? I have to send you a letter to revoke something I just set up for myself online? So again, really not working out very well. The authentication mechanisms that most of these applications online assume today, first of all, the knowledge of general demographic data when you were born, SSN, that sort of thing. They assume that you have the ability to navigate online, which is not an assumption that you should be able to make. They assume that you have physical mobility and that you have standardized IDs. If you do not have a Texas driver's license, you're kind of out of luck. If you are not mobile, you cannot go to the DMV and stand in line to get a Texas ID card, even if you can't drive anymore or you never could drive. Kids are not going to have ID cards except maybe for the occasional student ID. Again, they assume that a different email equals a different person. They assume that phone numbers only belong to one person. So if you have a family and you have a shared house phone, they may complain about that. And then finally, there's no cleverness in the security challenge answers. They really don't like that. So speaking of security challenge questions, this is another thing that's been bugging me for years. So a lot of applications require you to change your password every 90 days. And we all know what this is from, right? This is from the days, like decades ago when they estimated it would take 90 days to crack a password. That's why they picked the 90 days. This is the mainframe days. This is not the case anymore. You can sneeze and crack, 5 passwords. So they still make you change passwords every 30, 60, 90 days, but they don't make you change your security challenge answers. So what's easier to do? There are a lot of online things where I just don't bother to remember my password. I just have it reset because I know my security answer is never going to change. So there's a dynamic factor, but the second factor is static. So this is my dad. My dad wrote one of the first Fortran compilers. That is his old UCP email address, for those of you who know that format. He wrote, and it's still online, the story of Mel, a real programmer, where he talks about the elegance of programming back in the day when you actually had to fit things into registers. The thing is that he was, he was very technical. You couldn't say he wasn't technical. He was certainly technical way before any of us were technical. But he kind of stopped around the 80s. He really preferred the command line. He wanted to stay with the command line. He hated Windows with a purple passion. He did not want any GUIs, and finally he settled for Linux, reluctantly. So there came a point, even though he had been technical, he did not want to go any farther and could not handle, he was confused by the online requirements that we have today. Reading something off of a little secure ID token and trying to type it in changed. Trying to type it in again. This is the sort of thing that a lot of people can no longer deal with, even if they were technical. I can't make my dad jokes because, at his time he could do things in programming that I could never do. He could write entire programs in his head. He would just sit there for hours in his chair in the living room, just thinking. And then after a while, he'd get up and go type it in. Or if somebody called him and there was a bug in his code, he would get the description of it, he'd sit down in his chair, he'd think for an hour and go, and he'd know exactly where to go to fix it. So he could do a lot of stuff, but that technical stuff is not enough to help you with the online bureaucracy and functions that we need today. Also, it's a good thing he didn't believe in security. Because when he had a stroke, I had to break into his accounts and take over paying the bills because my mom was no longer capable of doing anything, and she never paid the bills online anyway. So I broke into his Gmail account because, if you get somebody's mail account, you can reset all the other passwords. So, that's what I did. And by the way, why is it that there aren't more representative types of female hackers? There's the Manic Pixie Dream Girl, which, I totally am not. I think I'm more like Mrs. Roberts from the XKCD comic. Although even I can't type with an oven mitt on. So things to consider when you are taking over your parents' or somebody else's accounts. Especially if they are still alive, they are still functional, they may be upset at the idea of you taking them over, but they need the help. How do you do this? Very, very carefully. Once you get in there, are you going to use your own login with delegation? What if the delegation is not complete? You don't have all the same entitlements that they have? Or do you use their login? If you're going to log in, are you going to change their passwords? Because if you do, they can't get back in. You're going to use their passwords. You're going to have to start managing all of those. Luckily, I can say that things like LastPass handle that very well. Different logins for the same site with different passwords. So that's helpful. Do you reset all the challenge answers? It's a good thing I happen to know what the name of my dad's first pet was. Oh my God, that was 80 years ago. What was his first pet's name? Do you use your phone and your email for 2FA, or do you use theirs? Because if you take it away from them, they can't use it anymore. So that's a big problem. These are things that you need to think about. The arguments for using their accounts include the fact that, many organizations just can't deal with this yet. They're not set up, for this concept, either procedurally or, from a technical perspective. And doing it the formal way, again, requires cooperation. Somebody gave a talk, I don't remember where, I think it was in Atlanta, about their experience when one of their parents passed away and they had to go convince, these different organizations to let him have access to his father's accounts. It's different when they're dead and you have a death certificate, but again, when they're alive, and you're sort of time-sharing, doing things on their behalf, most organizations can't deal with that. Again, it requires mental capacity, it requires paperwork, it requires mobility. My dad was at the point where I couldn't just put him on the phone and say, yes, tell them to do this for me, because he was never really sure who he was talking to. Or what he was saying would not make enough sense to them, and they would not really believe, So they thought maybe I was trying to pull a scam or something. By that time it's really, really difficult. They cannot go to the bank branch and show their ID. They literally, they physically cannot make it. And again, this is the same for other disabled people, disabled adults, whatever. And then, another argument for using their accounts is that if you are logged into your account, there may be confusion about which accounts you're working with or which entitlements you're working with at any given time. So if you log into their account, you're working on their behalf. If you're in your account, you're working on your behalf. So there's not as much possible confusion. On the other hand, the arguments against doing this, if the organization catches you, it will block you. So I had some sets of accesses to my parents' banking accounts through my own account, but for some reason I didn't have access to one of those accounts. So I would log in as my mother and do things. At one point I transferred money from one account to another, to one of my accounts, and they decided this was fraud. So they blocked that account. And they left calls from my mother. She didn't understand what they were talking about. And they wanted her to come in, again, with her ID and explain that, it was really okay for me to be doing this. She couldn't do that. But I just logged back into my account and I had access to most of the other accounts that way. The other thing is, again, the principal account owner, they may still believe that they can do these things. They may get confused. They may blame you for their confusion. Like, you changed something, you messed something up, and now I don't know what to do. Well, whether that's true or not. And then again, the technical confusion can result. Speaking of technical confusion, so this is how Google turned me into my mother. And in memory of my mother, who, did I leave this in here? Yes. In memory of my mother who passed away last month, I have stuffed a Kleenex up my sleeve. This is how she turned me into Google turned me into my mother. I had 4 Gmail accounts on the same system on my laptop. I had a work one, I had a private one for me. I was managing my dad's Gmail account and my mom's. And what I did was, I added my other personal email as an alternate address for my mother's account. You can do that. So I added my address, wendy@nather.com, as an alternate email address, and my mother's, regular Gmail account, with her full name. What happened was, anybody who used Gmail at all, who emailed wendy@nather.com, got my mother's name appended to it as the real name. And the first time I got that, I was like, wow, that's scary. And in fact, if my mother hadn't been alive at that time, it would have been really freaky. I'm suddenly being named by people who do not know my mother, have no reason to know my mother, who are emailing me for the first time, and they have my mother's name on it. That was just really freaky. And why is this a problem? Well, if you're Superman, and you have an alternate address of clark@kent.com, anybody using Gmail at all who composes an email to clark@kent.com, it will very helpfully put the real name of Superman up there for you. And it does it live as you start composing the email. So yeah, this is a problem. I tried to explain this to Google and ask them about it because I didn't know if it was an actual bug or, whatever. And they said, no, we meant to do that. It's working as programmed. So I was like, okay. So it's okay for me to talk about this. And they were like, yeah, okay. But it is a problem. It's an unanticipated privacy problem. Other problems that we need to address as a community, as IT people, as security people, is that of course adding delegation doubles the attack surface. That person could get owned through your account or their account. And how do you monitor for fraud properly? Again, there's the example where I was supposed to be, I wrote a check for something for my mother and then reimbursed myself from her account. And that was suddenly flagged as fraud. Although I could log into her account and pay bills to other people with her account and it was not a problem. So how do we monitor for actual, misuse? How do we describe the functions that somebody should legally be able to carry out online and monitor just for those? How does revocation work, especially if somebody is so incapacitated that they can't make sense on the phone, they can't read a document, they can't sign it? How are they going to revoke that if they change their mind? And what if they're to be honest, in the middle of dementia and they decide suddenly that you are trying to steal from them and they want to revoke it? How do you deal with that? My mother has no idea how to call up Amazon or Facebook or whatever. And so obviously revocation and recertification, which is another thing we love to do in enterprises, recertification, those all assume that those people are still capable of receiving email, reacting to it, understanding it, receiving a phone call, being able to have that discussion, which is not necessarily the case. So that's a big problem. It's a heartbreaking problem if you're dealing with declining parents or somebody else who is terminally ill and you're having to take these things over for them. But also, to make things worse, bear in mind that what I did probably kind of a little bit violated the CFAA. Just a tiny bit. So this is another case where, again, we need legal protections in place for caretakers to be able to do this sort of thing, as well as technical functions that support this sort of workflow. Some short-term recommendations, because I hate complaining without suggesting some things. First of all, with you and your loved ones, wherever possible, get those pieces of paper now. If you're in a committed relationship and you believe that, you would ask that person to take care of things, if you couldn't, then by all means do that now. Get those in place now. Get central password management of some kind. When I was going through my mother's papers after she passed away, I found like about this many different scraps of paper with different random passwords written on them. I have no idea what they're for, but I just collected all of them and I thought if I ever can't get into something, I'm going to try each one of these. I don't know if these were past, present, future passwords, I don't know. But the question you can ask anybody is if you were sick in the hospital and you needed to pay your bills, like right away, how would you do that? Would you need me to do that? That's a safe conversation to have with just about anybody. Longer term, we really need industry-wide standardization. We need reference architectures for how to deal with proxies and delegation. We need better integration of the physical world as well as legal and technical authentication. And we need things that address the needs of disabled people as well as those of us who, carry a phone all the time, know exactly what to do. We can log in our sleep. We have Touch ID. How do you deal with Touch ID? Luckily, my parents never made it as far as Touch ID on a phone. If they had, I don't know what I would, well, I suppose I could have taken it, but that's another thing, and actually I think somebody found out recently that you can add additional fingerprints while you're registering current ones when you're doing the setup for Touch ID on the iPhone. If in the process where, you have to do it a couple of times, if you put some other fingerprints in there, it adds them. So you could have somebody else do that. I know some people have had kids who, when their parents were sleeping, took their finger and, unlocked their phone because they wanted to get into it. But again, this assumption that 2FA, cannot be fungible, cannot be shared. What if you're doing banking and you live in Maryland and your parents live in Texas? You can't pass a token around. So that's another big functional thing that we have to address. We need to create third-party identity authorities for relying parties to use. I know there's a lot of work going on this, a lot of projects. Everybody would love to be the central authority. It probably won't be one. But again, thinking about what different contexts you have as a consumer as opposed to being in an organization, we're going to have to work that out. And then better adaptation for disabilities. I know there's a lot of work that has been done, but again, it's assuming one device, one user, or one account, one user. And that's not the way that we need it to work in the real world. Ultimately, what I think we really need are services to help the general public make sense of this. Them determine what their wishes are, and then enact them technically, set them up technically. Because, all of us in the room know how to navigate through these. The rest of the world doesn't. Most people don't. And that's not fair because the legal has become the online more and more these days. The financial and the legal are all online. We can't disenfranchise people by expecting them to be able to do all of the same things that we do. So I've actually, when I gave this talk at B-Sides London, I did have some people come up to me from banks later on and said, yeah, sort of a digital concierge service might be something we could set up. How could we do that? Because they were also already helping their customers navigate other sorts of legal things. And, if they could set something up that just helped them into the digital world, I think that would be great. But I'm sure some of you also have, ideas or suggestions on how we could set something up like that. So that's my talk on behalf of both of my parents, who never really understood the technology of today. I thank you for listening, and I hope we can work on solutions together. Any questions or comments? Yeah. There are all sorts of products out there. I use LastPass myself. For all of these, people have different preferences as to what they use, and well, if you're in physical, I think LastPass is pretty easy to use, but you may need to, everybody reacts to GUIs differently, so you may want to try a few and see which one you feel is more understandable. Yeah. Some of them, once in a while, there'll be a breach or a vulnerability reported in one of them, but, I don't know. I don't know, Eric, do you know of any place that lists different password managers? Yeah. Yeah, I think if you just, Google for password managers, there's probably some trade articles on, here are your top 15 password managers or whatever. Yeah. Yeah. Anything else? All right, cool. Thank you.